Hey folks, I'm going to continue talking about some of the chapter 3 stuff. We're going to pick up after approximate and ultimate questions and start with hormones, since this chapter is about hormones in neurobiology and behavior. But let's start with hormones in this short lecture. To understand hormones, we have to consider the endocrine system as a whole. In psychology, we spend a lot of time talking about the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, the peripheral portions of the central nervous system, but we spend very little time talking about the chemical signaling system that's the endocrine system. This is a communication system in organisms, and there are glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream that comprise this chemical system. I've put an overview video for you in the Blackboard folder. Hormones are synthesized in each one of the glands. The glands include the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands, for example, and they're released by specialized cells called endocrine cells. These endocrine cells are the key players in the endocrine system that do allow for that secretion of those hormones that are synthesized in the system. There are different subsets of hormones like neurohormones that are released by neurons, protein hormones that don't really need a chaperone cell to get through the system, steroid hormones, which you are likely to have heard of as well. These are distributed through the bloodstream, which do require a chaperone. And then also another key word that we should know is the targets. The target cells are the places where the hormones bind. So the hormones can circulate forever if there's nowhere for them to bind, right? And ultimately they can even be broken down. But target cells are where they can bind, and that's when they have an effect on something. Here is a figure representation of what I'm talking about. In the top right, you can see the target cells that are there, and they're connected with the bloodstream, and they have specialized receptors on them, and those little yellow dots are connecting to those specialized receptors. In the bottom left, you can see the basic endocrine cells. So these hormones are synthesized in the specialized endocrine cells. They're contained in vesicles. These vesicular structures are denoted by the blue circles that have the little yellow hormone bubbles in them, and then they bind with the outside of the endocrine cell, and they're released into the bloodstream, and they then can bind to their specialized receptors on those target cells. There are so many different kinds of hormones, and knowing them all is really beyond the scope of this class. We're going to talk about the hormones that are involved in stress later in this class. But hormones can change cellular processes. At a very specific level, they can open ion channels. Those ion channels are the specialized channels on cells that can open and let different ions in and out. For example, sodium, potassium. And when this takes place and there's a shift in the cell's charge, then you can see a neural signaling effect that will take place. Think about the action potential, for example, when you think about neural signaling. And hormones can actually influence neuron signaling. They influence cell division, but hormones can also cause us to have muscle contractions. They can change gene expression, change the way that we grow, change our mood, change our personality, our reproductive process, and hormones can act on one another. Some hormones can even act as neurotransmitters, like oxytocin. And oxytocin can, for example, do things as complex as incite feelings of bonding between a mother and her newly born child. And they can also influence stress as mediated by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis, is a key player in the endocrine system. Think about the times when everybody gets sick in February because they've got the flu. People get stressed out, their immune system functioning is lower, and they come into contact with the flu because they're stressed. They have a lot of stress hormones in their system, and this can all be taxing on their immune system. That is the interaction between the endocrine system and the immune system, for example. But this HPA axis results when There's a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone, and it's released from the hypothalamus in the brain. You're probably familiar with the hypothalamus in the brain. You may not be familiar with the pituitary gland, also located in the brain. The anterior portion of that pituitary gland will release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is another hormone. That in turn stimulates adrenal glands. Those adrenal glands are actually located on your kidneys, and that produces stress glucocorticoid hormones such as cortisol, for example. It's really a mouthful. That cortisol is a stress hormone. If you will notice, we'll talk a little bit about Sapolsky's work in the class, and he was the guy who was out in Africa in grad school blow darting baboons because he wanted to study their stress hierarchy. And in that stress hierarchy, he noticed that the animals that were more stressed, that were lower in the aggression hierarchy, had higher rates of cortisol. So hormones can affect behavior, which pertains to the class topic, since this is an animal behavior class. It can increase or decrease aggression in some animals. I did provide an additional folder for you in Blackboard, and you can just click on it. It's a video, and that will describe the HPA axis a little bit more in depth. Another example of how hormones can affect behavior includes the length of the day and breeding in birds. In the summer, when the season changes, the days get longer, and birds will begin to breed during that time a little bit more, and there are hormones circulating in the system like gonadotropin and testosterone, and they will actually change as the seasons change. So they get an increase in these hormones when the day gets longer. That results in males becoming more aggressive because their testosterone is higher. They defend their brood more, so they're taking after their progeny with a little bit of extra parental care. They produce more sperm as a result of changes in gonadotropin. And scientists can actually work a little bit harder to make a more compelling case about this by manipulating this in the lab than they would be able to if they just went out and measured hormone levels when the animals are in their natural environment. So they can bring in the animals and they can remove the parts of their system that produce these hormones and then look to see what the changes are in the total absence of those hormones, and they can experimentally replace them in different levels. Here's an overview of how the hormones work with the central nervous system. They work in conjunction with our sensory input, our central nervous system. The effectors are things like muscles that allow us to do something, and all of that culminates into us being able to witness observable behaviors with animals. So hormones can change behavior. They can change things like how ready the animal is to act in a particular situation. They can incite behaviors, modify behaviors, and organize behaviors. For example, males that have higher testosterone are more likely to win a fight. You'll notice that there's no animal that's listed there that I'm talking about particularly, and that's because that's true of many different animals in the animal kingdom. One more example of hormones influencing behavioral organization as a developmental consideration. Check out this female mouse. She's pregnant with a lot of babies simultaneously. They can have a lot of different babies. So the number of babies that's depicted there may be like an average, but they can have like up to 20 babies. It's really bizarre. And if we take a male and he's surrounded in utero with two other males, he will have more circulating testosterone as an adult as opposed to the male fetus that's surrounded by two females in utero. The amount of circulating testosterone that these different fetuses are exposed to will directly influence how much testosterone that they have later in life, even when they're fully grown adults, which is pretty amazing. One context that you might have learned about the endocrine system in your psych classes is the fight or flight response. And nowadays, many people are referring to it as a fight, flight, or freeze response because there's that third option. There's a lot of animals, including humans, that will freeze whenever they're encountering a difficult situation. The endocrine system is what powers this fight or flight response. When there's a stressor, for example, our hypothalamus stimulates the adrenal glands and they secrete epinephrine, which increases blood flow to the periphery. So you've got all this blood coming out to the outer areas versus the core. And you get a increased heart rate. Your heart's boom, 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 boom. Changes the blood sugar. Decreases digestion and reproductive system activity. So, a large animal comes into your campsite. It's really not time to ovulate, right? Okay, so the hypothalamus secretes a hormone cocktail. It's called a cocktail because there are a lot of different hormones in it. Corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, will influence the anterior pituitary gland and the brain. And then cortisol is released. That's that stress hormone that I was telling you about that's been documented in many of Sapolsky's baboon papers. And then sugar is converted for energy. And then we have changes in water retention and bleeding is reduced. So all this blood flows out to the periphery. That brings more oxygen and the muscles are more prepared to work. So somebody can actually run faster during this time than they would if they did not have this process. And that aids in survival. So I talked to you about the male rodents that are the 2M males or the 2F males. We also see this in Mongolian gerbils. 2M males will have higher testosterone, and it will actually be twice as high in adulthood. These males mount females faster, so they're more ready to engage in copulation. They ejaculate faster. They sire more offspring. I've seen a really interesting paper recently that looked at male mating behaviors in rodents that were the 2M males. Female rats confer their readiness to mate with ear wiggling. So ear wiggling is like really sexy for rats. And the males will respond more to ear wiggling if they're the 2M males. The fact that they have all these changes in behavior based on testosterone, not changes, I should say differences in behavior when compared to the 2M males, is called the testosterone hypothesis. So higher testosterone will result in these changes. For example, we can apply this to parental care. Males with higher testosterone in adulthood will exhibit less parental care. And if you take those males and castrate them so those circulating hormones aren't there, they will begin to manifest more parental care, but then you can replace those hormones by injecting them with testosterone and other things and remove that effect. So you can create the effect through castration, but you can replace the effect by putting the hormones back into the system. One more example for the chapter is going to be having to do with neurobiology and hormones. I'll start with the hormone part. These are prairie voles. Most voles are polygynous. So we have the field vole, the snow vole, the heather vole, there's lots of different kinds of voles, right? They're typically polygynous. But this prairie vole depicted here is monogamous. They typically mate for life. Just one male or female will mate together for one whole season. But researchers have even found that they'll mate for life in some places. Let me just quickly define mating systems because we'll be using this terminology throughout the semester. Polygamy refers to multiple partners for that organism, and that breaks down into several categories. So polygyny is one male and two or more females. That's typically what we see with the voles. Polyandry is one female and two or more males. Polygyandry is a variable number of males and females. Everybody mates with everybody. Monogamy occurs when there's one male and one female, typically for one breeding season, and this is also referred to as pair bonding. Back to the voles that are monogamous. There is a hormone in the brain that's produced during mating, and it's called vasopressin. That vasopressin hormone binds to specialized receptors. Think back to the picture that I showed you earlier in this lecture. Those receptors are located in the ventral pallidum. If you'll notice, there's a slice here of a vole brain where you can see the ventral pallidum located there. The way that they get this slice is they decapitate the vole, they take off the skull, they take out the brain, they clean it, they fix it in something like formalin, and then they soak it in sugar water so that it's a little bit more robust. If you try to just slice tissue, sometimes it gets all torn up. So you fix it in sugar because it won't change the composition of the slice, and then you slice it very thinly, like 80 microns with a fancy deli slicer basically, and then you mount those tissue onto slides, and then you can look at them under the microscope, and that's what we're seeing here. In this slice, you can see the ventral pallidum down there, or the ventral pallidum, depending on what book or rat atlas or vole atlas you look at. And inside that area of the brain, there are receptors called the V1A. The binding of hormones at that area to those receptors actually signals a reward process. These monogamous prairie voles have V1A receptors in that area, so the vasopressin hormone in their system is able to bind, and they may have a rewarding experience, whereas polygynous voles, all the rest of the voles, don't have the gene that encodes for the expression of the V1A receptors. And what that means is they don't have the receptors that allows vasopressin to bind and allows them to have this rewarding experience. If you click this link here, you'll be able to see the Young Lab. I can't get it to pull up here while I'm recording, but you'll be able to see some of the work that they've done related to this issue. These are some pictures of the distribution of those receptors in that area of the brain in these voles. So this hormone is involved in mating, mate choice, pair bonding, the amount of time that the males spend with their young, and even prosocial behaviors, or behaviors that indicate that that organism is cooperating with other conspecifics. That is just one example of hormones. Let me give you another one, honeybees, just one more before I move on to neurobiology. There is a hormone in juvenile honeybees, and when it is switched on, they change their overall role within their system. So they go from cleaning, feeding, and guarding behaviors, just maintenance kind of behaviors, to actually going out and leaving and becoming foragers. And this happens around 21 days, when they've been alive for 21 days. And scientists have determined that this occurs whenever a hormone is released from the corpus allotrum. And they can confirm that in the lab by doing an allomectomy, so they can go in and remove that area of the brain, or ganglion, if you will, if you don't want to call it a brain. And then bees will go and enter that foraging stage much later, because that hormone isn't being released from that area to incite that early foraging kind of behavior. Okay, so next time I'll start with neurobiology.